we're going to start with the tariff debate. In 1828, Congress passed a very high tariff on all manufactured goods coming from Europe. Manufacturers in the North loved it. Remember, they're producing things. They're economically independent, and they know that that makes Southerners buy their products. Now, Southerners hated the new tariff because that meant that goods, or Europe, placed a tariff on cotton. And so they were struggling to ship their cotton everywhere. So, in fact, the South protests. Southern politicians and plantation owners were outraged. Now, the vice president, that name should look familiar, he was a war hawk. Vice President Calhoun argued. He very simply said, look, a state or a group of states had the right to nullify, determine that a federal law they don't have to listen to if they thought it was unconstitutional. Can you imagine if today states could just simply ignore federal law? Oh, that's right, they have with marijuana use. We'll get to that in a government. Now, some Southerners called for the South to secede from the U.S. That is a key term that you will need to know. Secede means to leave or withdraw. Calhoun agreed. Remember, he kind of gave them this idea that they had the right to remove itself if they didn't agree with it. He argued this broad idea of states' rights. As you might have guessed, many Northerners disagreed with Vice President Calhoun. So where does President Jackson stand on this issue? States' rights, federal government. Jackson is forced to take a stand. April 1830, he was invited to a dinner put on by supporters of states' rights. Guests waited to see what he had to say. How was he going to address this? Finally, President Jackson rose to his feet and spoke directly, looking straight into the eyes of Vice President John Calhoun, said, "Our federal union must be preserved." At that point, Calhoun realized that he and Jackson's views were opposite, and he resigned shortly after that. Jackson had made it clear, you are not to secede from this union. However, Congress heard as well, and in 1832 they passed a lower tariff. But South Carolina wasn't happy. They led the fight against this tariff, and they passed the Nullification Act, declaring that it would not pay what it deemed illegal tariffs of 1828 or the tariffs of 1832. In response, Congress can't let this go without a response, and so they passed what is called the Force Bill, allowing the president to use the United States military to enforce acts of Congress. Now remember, it is the president's job to enforce the laws of the land. South Carolina played chicken and they lost. They accepted the compromise tariff and agreed that they would nullify their Nullification Act. This was the first act talking about secession. And so, very powerfully, the government tells South Carolina and the rest of the country that they will stop you from seceding. You just have to deal with conflicts of secession. You had to deal with conflicts of key terms, the Indian Removal Act. Now, Native Americans have been here for centuries. Centuries before white people. But initially, the area west of the Mississippi, over that line, was dry. It is dry. We live over here. We know that it's dry. Unsuitable for farming. There is no irrigation at this time. And so few white Americans wanted to live there. Settlers instead wanted to expand and move Native Americans that had been living in the Southeast. In particular, Georgia, Florida, those locations. And Jackson had supported this demand. In fact, he made a presidential campaign based upon the promise that he would push out these Native Americans. So in 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act. Theoretically, it allows the federal government to buy the land that the Indians own or inhabit and give them land to move west. However, it also forces this upon the Native Americans. Now, most accepted payment, and they agreed to move. And in fact, in 1834, Congress creates the Indian Territory in Oklahoma for these Native Americans to move, to be relocated. Not everyone chose to move. In fact, the Cherokee refused to move. In the 1790s, the government had recognized the Cherokee people in Georgia as a separate nation with its own laws. A separate nation. Now, the Cherokee people had learned very quickly that they must adapt if they wanted to survive. The Cherokee people changed their lifestyle. They built 2-story log cabins to live in. They stopped wearing traditional dress and moved to wearing cotton clothing. In fact, many of these Cherokees raised cotton and owned slaves. They had converted to Christianity. They established a written language, something that none of the other tribes had, a written language. And with that written language, they created laws. They created a constitution, 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? They created a newspaper to communicate with their people. Except Georgia didn't like what the Cherokee had done, because the Cherokee couldn't change one thing, and that was the color of their skin. So the state of Georgia refused to recognize Cherokee laws. And the Cherokee sued the state of Georgia and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall, I told you we would talk about him again, ruled that based upon the United States Constitution and the language in the Constitution stating that Indian tribes were their own nation, sovereign nations, that Georgia had no right to interfere with the Cherokee. The decision had been made. The Cherokee were supported. However, President Jackson, based upon his comments, his presidential promise, supported Georgia in their efforts to remove the nation. And in fact, he is quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." It became very clear to the Cherokee Nation that the President of the United States was not going to uphold the Constitution in this terms, in this situation. So we have one of the worst situations in American history. In 1835, the federal government had persuaded a few Cherokee to sign a treaty because in American terms, if you represent the country, the people, you have signed over the land for all. It's not how it works in the Native American culture. Native American culture, every person is allowed to make their own decision. Just because one signs the treaty does not mean that all have to abide. And in fact, 17,000 Cherokee refused to honor this treaty. Well, in 1838, General Winfield Scott is given permission and encouragement, along with an army of 7,000 federal troops, to move these 17,000 Cherokee to Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the Cherokee knew that if they resisted, they would be destroyed. They began their trek to Oklahoma. Brutal weather along the way and harsh marching conditions claimed the lives of thousands of Cherokees. Their forced march, their forced journey, became known to them as the Trail of Tears. They said if you looked behind, you could see where the Cherokee came from, following the river of tears, from crying over their lost land, their lost way of life, and their lost loved ones. It's a brutal, brutal imagery. Numerous artists have portrayed it. This is a more recent image of what the Trail of Tears might have looked like. Mass numbers of people carrying anything and everything that they owned with them. Notice the clouds in the background. Those are very symbolic of the dark days. Nobody in this image looks very happy. Now, the Cherokee were forced to leave, but there were some that did resist and some that attempted to resist. In 1832, the Sauk chieftain of Black Hawk led the Sauk and Fox people back to Illinois, their homeland. They wanted to recapture this area. Unfortunately, they were met by the Illinois state militia and federal troops. Hundreds of them were killed, and the survivors were chased into present-day Iowa. They could not successfully resist. But the Seminole people of Florida were, and in fact are, the only Native Americans who successfully blocked their removal. The chief and some of his people refused to leave, and they decided to go to war with the United States. In 1835, they joined forces with a group of runaway slaves, and they attacked white settlements by using guerrilla tactics. Attack and disappear. Attack and disappear. By 1842, the United States had lost 1,500 of the 10,000 soldiers who they had sent to fight in the Seminole Wars. Now, many of these that had died of diseases found in the swamp conditions in Florida. The government gave up and allowed the Seminoles to remain in Florida. It wasn't completely successful. Many Seminoles had died in the Long War. Many more were captured, and those that had been captured were relocated. But they were successful in maintaining their homeland. So we are going to do a